Most videos about privacy laws want to overwhelm you with legal jargon. This one is different. Today, I am not going to read you a list of laws and hope you stay awake. I am going to answer one specific question that most Americans have never actually gotten a straight answer to. Why does the United States, one of the most technologically advanced countries in the world, still not have one single comprehensive federal privacy law? Welcome to Cyber Safety Brief, where we explain simple cybersecurity advice for everyday Americans. Before we go further, here is something important. This video is based on authentic, legal, and publicly available cybersecurity information. Everything here is for awareness and understanding only. I am not here to tell you which political side is right or wrong. I am here to explain how the system actually works, so you can make better decisions about protecting your own information. Here is what I am not going to do in this video. I am not going to tell you the government doesn't care about your privacy. That is an oversimplified take, and honestly, it is not accurate. What I am going to do is walk you through the actual structural reasons this gap exists, reasons that have very little to do with anyone not caring, and a lot to do with how American law is built. Let's start with a question. If you asked 10 people why the US doesn't have a law like the EU's GDPR, most of them would guess something like lobbying or big tech blocking it. In my opinion, that is part of the story, but it is nowhere near the whole story. The real answer is more layered, and once you understand it, a lot of confusing headlines about state privacy laws will suddenly make a lot more sense. Point 1. The US was never built around one central privacy framework. Let's talk about the foundation first, because this is the part almost nobody explains clearly. Unlike the European Union, which built its data protection rules around a single overarching principle, that personal data is a fundamental right requiring uniform protection, the United States historically approached privacy in a completely different way. American privacy law developed sector by sector, problem by problem, rather than as one unified philosophy. Here's the part that surprises people. The US does have privacy laws, plenty of them. HIPAA protects your health information. GLBA protects your financial information at banks. COPPA protects children's data online. FERPA protects student education records. The problem is not that these laws don't exist. The problem is that they only cover specific industries and specific types of data. If your personal information falls outside of one of these narrow categories, in many cases, there is no federal law directly protecting it at all. What I personally think is that this sector-by-sector approach made a lot of sense historically. Each of these laws was created in response to a specific, visible problem. HIPAA came after concerns about medical records being mishandled. COPPA came after concerns about companies collecting data from children online. The pattern is consistent. A problem happens, public pressure builds, and Congress passes a narrow law targeting that specific issue. In my opinion, this reactive piece-by-piece pattern is baked into how American lawmaking tends to function, and privacy has simply followed that same pattern rather than breaking from it. It also helps to understand what these sector-specific laws actually cover and where they stop, because the boundaries are more specific than people usually realize. HIPAA, for example, generally only applies to what are called covered entities, meaning hospitals, doctors, insurers, and their direct business partners. A health app built by a technology company that is not itself a hospital or insurer often falls entirely outside HIPAA's reach, even though it collects deeply personal health information. Similarly, GLBA applies specifically to financial institutions as legally defined, which means a budgeting app that is not itself a bank may not be bound by the same rules a traditional bank would be. In my opinion, understanding these narrow boundaries is exactly why so many modern apps exist in a kind of legal gray zone, technically handling sensitive data without technically qualifying as the type of company these older laws were written to regulate. But here is the real-life example that shows the gap this creates. Imagine a fitness app that tracks your location, your heart rate, and your daily habits. That app is not a hospital, so HIPAA does not apply. It is not a bank, so GLBA does not apply. It is not specifically marketed to children, so COPPA does not apply. Unless that app happens to operate in a state with its own comprehensive privacy law, there may be no dedicated federal law governing how that company handles your sensitive health and location data at all. The way I look at it, that gap is not a mistake in the system. It is a direct, predictable result of how the system was designed from the start. There is a historical reason behind this pattern that I think deserves more attention. The U.S. legal tradition around privacy actually goes back further than most people assume, to a famous 1890 law review article called The Right to Privacy, written by Samuel Warren and Louis Brandeis. That article laid groundwork for privacy as a legal concept in America, but it focused on protecting individuals from intrusion, things like unwanted photography or publication of private facts, not on regulating how organizations collect and use data at scale. In my opinion, this early framing matters because it shaped American privacy law around protecting people from specific harmful actions rather than regulating data itself as a category needing oversight. Europe eventually built its approach around the second idea. The U.S. largely stayed anchored to the first. Another structural factor worth understanding is how American regulatory agencies are set up. The Federal Trade Commission has broad authority to police unfair or deceptive business practices, and it has used that authority creatively over the years to take action against companies with poor data practices, even without a dedicated privacy statute to point to. In my opinion, this is a clever legal workaround, but it is fundamentally different from having a purpose-built privacy law with clear, specific rules written in advance. The FTC approach is reactive and somewhat unpredictable, since companies often do not know exactly where the line is until the FTC brings an enforcement action and effectively draws that line after the fact. Point 2. Congress has tried, repeatedly, and it keeps failing. Now, here is something a lot of people do not realize. Congress has actually tried multiple times to pass a comprehensive federal privacy law. This is not a topic nobody has thought about. Bills have been introduced repeatedly over the past several years with names like the American Data Privacy and Protection Act. Some of these bills made real progress, getting through committee votes and gaining bipartisan support at certain stages. What I personally think is interesting here is that the disagreement is rarely about whether privacy protection is a good idea. Almost everyone in Congress agrees privacy matters. The disagreement is about the details, and two specific details in particular tend to sink these bills every single time. The first sticking point is what is called federal preemption, meaning whether a new national law would override existing state privacy laws like California's CCPA. States that already built strong privacy protections do not want a weaker federal law to replace what they already have. Businesses, on the other hand, generally want one national standard instead of complying with 50 different state rules. That disagreement alone has stalled major bills multiple times. The second sticking point is called private right of action, meaning whether individual people should be allowed to personally sue a company for violating their privacy, rather than only a government agency being able to take action. Consumer advocates generally push hard for this because it gives real teeth to a law. Business groups generally push back hard against it because it opens the door to significant litigation. In my opinion, this single disagreement, more than almost anything else, is why bill after bill has quietly died before reaching a full vote. Here is a real-life example. The American Data Privacy and Protection Act came closer than almost any previous federal privacy bill in recent memory, moving through committee with rare bipartisan support. It still did not become law, largely because these exact two issues, preemption and private right of action, could not be resolved to the satisfaction of enough lawmakers before the legislative session ended. What I personally think is that this pattern will likely keep repeating until one side is willing to compromise significantly on one of these 2 points, and right now, neither side has shown much appetite for that. There is a third factor that gets far less attention but matters just as much, in my opinion. Privacy legislation in the U.S. does not fall neatly along one industry's interests. technology companies, healthcare companies, financial institutions, retailers, and advertising networks all have different, sometimes conflicting positions on what a federal privacy law should require. A rule that works well for a bank's existing compliance structure might be genuinely burdensome for a small e-commerce startup. This means that even when there is broad public support for a privacy law, the specific industries affected rarely agree on what that law should actually say, and that lack of unified industry consensus makes it harder for lawmakers to build the kind of coalition needed to pass complex legislation. I also think it is worth mentioning how election cycles play into this. Comprehensive legislation, especially anything this technically complex, tends to require sustained multi-year effort across multiple congressional sessions. Privacy bills have repeatedly lost momentum when committee leadership changes after an election, or when a new administration brings in different priorities. In my opinion, this timing problem is underrated as an explanation. It is not just that lawmakers disagree on privacy, it is that building consensus on something this complicated takes longer than the political cycle often allows before priorities shift again. Point 3. The states stepped in. Where Congress didn't. This is the part I think really matters for you personally, because so far this might sound like an abstract political stalemate that does not affect your daily life. It absolutely does. Here is what most people underestimate. Because Congress has not passed a comprehensive federal law, individual states started passing their own. California led the way with the California Consumer Privacy Act, later strengthened by the California Privacy Rights Act. Since then, states including Virginia, Colorado, Connecticut, Utah, and a growing list of others have passed their own comprehensive privacy laws, each with slightly different rules. In my opinion, this state-by-state approach creates a genuinely strange situation for everyday people. Your privacy rights in the United States can literally change depending on which state you live in. A resident of California has the right to know what data a company collects about them, request deletion of that data, and opt out of certain data sales. A resident of a state with no comprehensive privacy law at all may have none of those specific rights, at least not as a matter of state law, unless a narrower federal law happens to apply to their specific situation. Let me know in the comments if you agree with this, because I think a lot of people simply assume privacy protections are the same everywhere in the country, and that assumption is genuinely not accurate. Let's make this a little more concrete with an everyday example. Imagine two friends living in different states, both using the exact same shopping app. One friend, living in California, can formally request that the company delete all the personal data it has collected about her, and the company is legally required to comply within a set time frame. Her friend, living in a state without a comprehensive privacy law, might send that exact same request and have no state-level legal right to force the company to act on it at all, unless the company voluntarily chooses to honor it anyway. What I personally think makes this even more complicated is that these state laws are not identical to each other either. California's law includes a right to opt out of the sale and sharing of personal data, plus specific protections for sensitive categories like precise location and health data. Colorado's law includes similar rights, but structures enforcement differently. Virginia's law was actually criticized by some consumer advocates as being weaker, partly because it was heavily shaped by input from major technology companies during the drafting process. So even among states that have acted comprehensive privacy law does not mean the same level of protection everywhere. In my opinion, this adds a second layer of complexity on top of the first. It is not just, does your state have a law? It is, how strong is that specific law compared to the state next door? This also creates real compliance headaches for businesses, which indirectly affects you as a consumer too. A mid-sized company operating nationally may need to build entirely different data handling processes depending on where each customer lives, tracking which state's rules apply to which user. In my opinion, this is one of the strongest arguments in favor of an eventual federal law, not necessarily because state laws are bad, but because managing dozens of different overlapping requirements is genuinely expensive and complicated, and those costs often get passed down to consumers in ways that are not always visible. Point 4. Practical steps you can actually take. So, what can you, as a regular person, actually do with this information? Here are some genuinely practical defensive steps. First, find out whether your state has passed a comprehensive privacy law. This single fact determines a lot about what rights you actually have. States with these laws generally give you the right to access, correct, delete, and opt out of the sale of your personal data. If your state has one of these laws, learning how to actually exercise those rights is worth the 10 minutes it takes. Second, do not assume federal protection exists just because a company handles sensitive information. As we covered earlier, unless that company falls specifically under HIPAA, GLBA, COPPA, or a similar sector-specific law, federal privacy protection may simply not apply. Reading a company's privacy policy, even briefly, tells you more about your actual protections than assuming a law is automatically covering you. Third, understand that many major companies voluntarily apply their strongest privacy protections, like California's rules, to all their users nationwide, simply because it is easier to run one privacy system than several different ones. This is similar to what happens internationally with GDPR. In my opinion, this is one of the quiet ways many Americans outside of strong privacy law states still get meaningful protection, even without a state law requiring it. Fourth, pay attention to opt-out mechanisms, even in states without formal privacy laws. Many companies provide privacy settings, ad preference controls, and data deletion requests as a matter of policy, not legal requirement. Using these tools regularly is one of the few forms of practical control available to you, regardless of which state you live in. Fifth, keep an eye on ongoing federal efforts. In my opinion, a comprehensive federal privacy law is not a question of if, but genuinely a question of when, given how consistently this topic keeps returning to Congress. Watching which specific sticking points, preemption or private right of action, get resolved first will tell you a lot about what the eventual law will actually look like. Sixth, do not rely purely on the word privacy in an app's marketing to assume real protection exists behind it. In my opinion, this is one of the most common ways people get a false sense of security. A company can genuinely believe it respects your privacy while still operating in a legal environment where very little actually requires it to. Reading the actual data collection and sharing sections of a privacy policy, even skimming just those specific parts, usually tells you far more than any marketing language on the app's homepage ever will. Point 5. The bigger picture nobody talks about. Here is something I rarely see discussed clearly. The lack of a comprehensive federal privacy law is not really a story about privacy at all. It is a story about how federalism, meaning the balance of power between federal and state government, plays out in modern technology policy. The same structural tension that shows up in areas like minimum wage laws or environmental regulation is now playing out with your personal data. The way I look at it, this matters because whichever direction this eventually resolves will shape the digital experience of every American for decades. If Congress eventually passes a strong federal law that preempts state laws, some states may end up with weaker overall protection than they currently have. If Congress passes a weaker federal floor that allows states to add stronger protections on top, the current patchwork could actually continue indefinitely, just with a baseline added underneath it. I also think it is worth mentioning how this compares internationally, because it puts the U.S. situation into sharper focus. The European Union's GDPR applies uniformly across all member states. The UK maintains its own version after Brexit. Even countries like Brazil and South Korea have passed comprehensive national privacy laws in recent years. In my opinion, the United States is genuinely unusual among major economies in still relying on this sector-by-sector, state-by-state patchwork instead of one unified national standard. And that gap is becoming more noticeable every year as more countries move in the opposite direction. There is one more angle worth considering, and it is one I personally find the most interesting. Large U.S. companies operating internationally already have to comply with GDPR for their European users. Many of these same companies have found it easier to apply GDPR-level protections to their American users too, rather than building separate systems. If that trend continues, in my opinion, we may end up with something that functions like a national privacy standard in practice, built not by Congress, but by companies choosing efficiency over maintaining multiple systems. That would be a strange, unofficial way to end up with consistent protection, but historically, it would not be the first time practical business decisions ended up shaping policy outcomes that formal legislation could not achieve. I also want to add a point about generational change, because I think it is genuinely underrated in this conversation. Public awareness of data privacy has grown enormously over the past decade, largely driven by high-profile data breaches, targeted advertising controversies, and increased media coverage of how personal data gets bought and sold. In my opinion, lawmakers respond to sustained public pressure eventually, even when the process is slow and frustrating to watch. The same pattern happened with earlier consumer protection laws in American history, where public frustration built for years before Congress finally acted decisively. There is no guarantee privacy follows the exact same timeline, but the historical pattern at least suggests that continued public attention on this issue is not wasted effort, even if it does not produce results as quickly as people would like. Finally, I think it is worth acknowledging the argument on the other side honestly, because a one-sided take would not be fair. Some policy experts and business groups argue that the current patchwork, while messy, actually allows states to experiment and find what works before a single national standard gets locked in permanently. California's law, for example, has already been revised and strengthened once through the California Privacy Rights Act, something that would be much harder to do quickly with a single, harder-to-amend federal law. In my opinion, there is a genuine trade-off here between speed and flexibility on one hand and consistency and simplicity on the other, and reasonable people disagree about which one should be prioritized. I would also like to know your opinion. Do you think a comprehensive federal privacy law will actually pass in the next few years, or do you think this state-by-state pattern is here to stay? I am genuinely curious what people think, because this is one of those topics where reasonable people can disagree. If this video helps you understand online safety more clearly, like the video and subscribe to Cyber Safety Brief for more simple cybersecurity advice. Closing. Here is the honest summary. The U.S. does not have one comprehensive federal privacy law because American privacy protection developed sector by sector rather than as one unified philosophy. Because repeated congressional attempts have stalled over preemption and private right of action, because the FTC's reactive enforcement approach fills some gaps, but not all of them, and because individual states stepped in to fill the gap Congress left behind, each with slightly different rules. That is not meant to scare you. It is meant to help you understand that your privacy rights genuinely depend on where you live and which sector your data falls into. And now you know exactly which questions to ask to find out what protections you actually have, rather than assuming a law is quietly working in the background on your behalf. Stay alert, stay informed, and stay safe online. Before you go, comment below which tip you think most people ignore.